Hi, thanks for tuning in this morning to Front Porch Conversations. We're here at the Harmony Center today at Advent Christian Village, and we are having another little winter spree. That's what happens in North Florida. You think it's spring and everything blooms, and then it gets cold again. So we're most fortunate compared to most people's winter that they're getting right now. I want to introduce to you our guest, Helen Brooks. Helen, welcome.
Thank you.
And I have just recently gotten to meet Helen. I had read some of the articles that were published in the Friendly Neighbor News by Helen, and I was saying, I need to meet that lady and hear about her writing. Helen, would you tell our viewers where you grew up and where you were born?
I grew up in a place in Little Washington, Pennsylvania. It was an outside city, little town called Log Pile.
That's one of the most unusual town names I've ever heard.
Very unusual people you've ever met, too. It's right between West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania in that little corner. Mm-hmm. We were the corner. And it was a very unusual place.
Helen, tell us a little bit about what made that an unusual area.
Most of the people there are generations and generations of, I don't want to call them hillbillies, but they were country folk. And we were like 2 generations behind everybody else. We didn't have electricity for a while. We didn't have indoor plumbing. And my dad once said, because my mother really would love to have electric lights. And he said, you're not going to put no electricity in my house. It'll catch on fire. You don't bring fire in the house on purpose. So he went about his daily task of lighting his kerosene lanterns and putting them on the wall right in front of the cardboard dividers, divided the rooms apart. So that's a theory that when you're from that part of town, you got your own logic.
And you told me another story about outhouses.
Yeah, we had an outhouse set way up on a hill. And I was the youngest in the family. And sure enough, every time I'd get inside that little building, that thing would rock and knock. Here, all my brothers and sisters was up there beating on it, telling me the devil was after me and there was monsters. I was scared to death. But we got an inside bathroom, but my dad said, we ain't getting no inside toilet. Why would you want that in-house where you live? You eat in the house, you don't put one of those things in the house. But we did get one, so eventually we were civilized.
Well, tell me about your siblings.
I have 2 brothers and a sister. 2 brothers passed away recently, well, I would say the last 10 years. They had heart conditions and a lot of issues, health issues. Mm-hmm. And I have 1 sister left, and she's my nagging sister. Every time I get a book written, she says, when's the next one coming out? So she keeps after me to keep busy.
And tell our viewers how many books you've written and had published.
Well, I have 9 books published. Hopefully, I'll have number 10 before long. Our granddaughter is going to be hopefully doing the
illustrations and
artwork that's in the book. And it's my very first children's book, which you'd think I would have been writing children's books all along, because there's a part of me that hasn't yet grown up.
And I think that's a part of your imagination that you wanted to tell us about your imaginary life when you were young.
Oh, yes. I became a Christian when I was 9 years old, and I loved going to church. Well, they had a library there, and I would go into the church, and I'd look around and make sure nobody was watching. I'd sneak down to the library, and I'd pull a book off the shelf, and I'd hold it up to the preacher when I'd go by. He'd shake his head, yes. I'd go home and I'd hide underneath the covers of the blankets because my parents did not like me reading and getting fancy thoughts. So I would read that book. And in my mind, I had, I don't know how many missionary journeys I've been on. And sometimes it was hard to distinguish reality from my imagination, because I'd say, I'm going to Africa. I'm going to be a missionary. And I already have all my papers intact. All I have to do is just go and be that missionary. And I would tell everybody, boy, those animals kept me awake last night. And my parents thought I was a little bit imagining things, and that was a dangerous thing for my parents to deal with. But I pretty much stayed out of their way a lot.
Would you show us on camera one of the books you've written?
Well, this is the very first of my Forest Hill series. And this is Manny's Gift. And I started this in, I think, 2005. I had it published in 2009. And it was going to be my one book. But I didn't realize after I wrote it, I had all these phone calls, and they said, well, what happened to Edie, and what happened to Sam, and what's going on in Forest Hills, and what's the church doing? And I said, well, it's a book. It's fiction. They said, well, when's your next one coming out? And I said, when God sends it to me, because he sent me all my books. So they all have a kind of a strain of similarities, because they all have the same characters, and it'll focus on one character or another and resident in Forest Hills. So,
And Forest Hills is an imaginary town?
In Virginia. And this book here was probably very special to me, because so many things happened while I was writing this book. One thing was that I could not figure out how to form my character. And I wanted to get someone from another country who came to America. So I thought, well, let's see, another country, probably in Europe, and he's educated. Let's see, he could be an engineer. An engineer was open field. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, let's see, this took place in the 1960s. Now, what happened in the 1960s? There was a lot of inventions for rubber products, and all the Tupperware came out, and all the medical field, just really went crazy with all their new inventions. So I said, well, that's what we'll do. We'll make him an engineer, and probably Italy. And right popped into my mind, University di Milan. Now you tell me how a little girl from Log Pile can come up with the name University di Milan. But I did. I wrote his name down. I made up his name. His name was Manny. And I knew that somehow he was going to come to America. So as I created the character and his job, I said, well, let's see, he had to be famous, but how could he be? Oh, I know, he was going to do research, and he was going to devise some kind of an invention, and he would be famous for that. Okay, so we're going to have him working with a team of research scientists, and he is going to work in the study of plastics. And then I said, well, what's that called? So Mr. Google came to my...
One of your best friends and mine.
One of my best friends, he came to my aid, and he said, it's polymer science. So after I had the total character, everything was on paper, everything was formed out, and I looked up polymer science, and it said, a team of scientists from the University di Milan in Italy won the Nobel Peace Prize or some kind of invention prize for their study in polymer science. Now, where that came from, God. I don't have an inkling of how to come up with those things. But God came to me in my sleep, and he pestered me for days till I wrote everything down exactly as he wanted it. And then I just started going with it. So now I've got 9 books of those.
And more to come.
More to come.
How did you get started with writing?
Well, as I told you, I came from Log Pile. And I was the youngest. My mother was 30 when she had me, and I was not a welcome surprise. And all I knew, whenever I'd hear my mother's voice, she would say, what are you doing in the house? I said I felt like a stray dog. But I knew I could get into a lot of trouble. And Mom didn't have time or patience to deal with the new baby. So I would go find me a piece of linoleum up in the top of the place where I lived. There was a bunch of, everybody disposed of their trash and things up there. Well, I found a real pretty piece of linoleum, and I dragged it down to our house, and I slid it up under the porch. And I stayed under there whenever I wanted to be alone to read or anything. And I remember that she was saying, "Where are you? Where are you?" And I better hurry and get out of here because she's going to find out my hiding place. And I was scurrying out of my hiding place to find my mother, and I had my papers there because I would draw and I would do all sorts of things. That was my hideaway. And I started writing down. I had to come up with an excuse. Where was I? Where was I? Oh, I was out. Let me see. I was out at Maureen's house, and I was making up lies, but they were stories to me. And I started writing like that. And then she didn't believe a word I said. She just said, "I want you where I can see you," because I had a propensity for getting into trouble. We would go into a grocery store, and I would be the one to pick that orange off that bottom pyramid. And I
just to see how they would roll. Huh?
Well, it made sense to me. Why else would they put one in my reach?
That's a good thought.
But I was a handful. And but God took the creative side of me, imagination side of me, and He really became my best friend, my very best friend.
And you said at 9 years old,
9 years old. There was a lot of friction in our home, and Dad was mad at one of the boys, and he was running after him. He was going to get a hold of him, and boy, what that boy wasn't going to get when he got a hold of him. And I got scared, and I said, "Mama, we need to pray. We need to pray, Mom." And she says, "Yeah, you pray. You get on down to that church where they'll take care of you, and you just get out away from me. I need to deal with this." So I ran, and it was pouring down rain, and I could just feel that mud between my toes. I didn't wear shoes very much. And I was running down there. I could feel that rain in my face, and I couldn't tell what was tears and what was rain. I dropped on the floor, and I looked up, and I saw this picture of Jesus holding a little lamb. And I don't know why I never talked to him before, because I'd been going to church since I was old enough for Mom to chase me out the door. And I looked up and I said, "Jesus, you're holding that little lamb. Why can't you hold me just today? Just today, God, one time." I said, "Jesus, can't you hold me like that?" And I lay there and I cried my heart out. And that was the day that He picked me up off that floor, and He held me in His arms, and He never let go. So that was a beautiful day for me.
And it's been with you every day since.
Every day, every night, He wakes me up and tells me stories.
That must be a fascinating conversation.
We have many conversations. Sometimes they're not so good because He tells me what I'm not doing right.
Helen, when did you first come to the village? What was the occasion that you...
I had a book signing, and this was the book that I brought to the village. Mm-hmm. And I had a book signing and did very well. And I walked around the village and I said, "This is a beautiful place. I would love to retire here someday." Not now. I was too young for that. Mm-hmm. Someday. And now, all these years later, I'm living in the village. And I moved here. Actually, it's been a little over a year ago. March 5th, I moved in. And I couldn't believe that that God brought me through all my mistakes, walked with me through every bad road, every bad experience. He took me through. You might be going through something, but remember that word "through." He's not going to drop you off in the middle of it. So He brought me through a lot of bad experiences. brought me to the village and showed me the beauty of this place, showed me the people that could love me. And when I walked in the door, I felt like I was empty at first. And I walked in, and Charles Johnson was sitting at the counter.
And that's at the Carter House
At
desk.
the Carter House. And he said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I feel like I don't know anybody, and I feel so lonely." And I said, "I feel like I don't even have family anymore." And he said, "Oh, yes, you have family. We love you, and you're our family now." And for some reason, that made a difference. It was like God said, "Listen to Charles now. Listen to Charles. He's going to take care of you. He's going to love you. The family here is going to love you." And have.
Well, speaking of love, what else happened after you moved in?
Oh, well, I met somebody. I never thought it was possible, because all this time I'd been a Christian since I was 9. And it seemed like everybody that I would meet, they weren't really Christians. And I had struggles and bad days and bad years and bad decades and panics. But God had a plan. He not only brought me to the village, but he brought me someone who was also similar in my lifestyle, similar in so many ways. In fact, we lived in 3 different states at different times, and we knew some of the same people.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's just like, wow, God, you sure are having fun with this life of mine, But I met him at the community room at Carter House, and he played a banjo and he played the guitar. My dad used to love music, and that brought some kind of good feelings back, And he said, "Well, if you like this kind of music, why don't you come to my church? We sing this kind of music." So I started going to church, and he started going to church with me, and next thing you know, we were seeing each other. And December 24th, 2022, I became Mrs. Brooks. So Joe Brooks and I got married at the Little White Church, Pine Level Missionary Baptist Church. And God has about smiled on us ever since.
Well, and for our viewers, you may have watched a Front Porch Conversation a year or so ago with Joe Brooks, and Joe's here sitting in the wings supporting you
Yes,
today.
he is.
Thank you, Joe, for coming today, too. You were talking about going to church together,
Yes.
and you've become active in the church there.
We're both pretty active in the church. It just our home away from home. In fact, sometimes I think we live there more than we live at home. But we have our Bible study at home, and we listen to the Bible on tape, and we're very careful, because it's a rough world out there, and if you're not careful, you can make some bad choices, and it's hard to get back where you need to be. So we make sure that we're both holding on tight to the Lord's hands, make sure we're where we need to be.
And I understand you have children.
I have children. I have 2 sons, and I had a daughter. She'll always be my daughter, but she passed away 8 years ago. She had a heart attack and passed away, but she knew about the Lord. She was my only daughter, and you know how that can be.
Well, no, I don't. But
Well,
I was an only daughter.
Well, there you go,
Yeah.
see? But there's just that special relationship you have when there's 2 females that just make each other's life just work. And I have 2 sons. One son is in Virginia. He retired from the military. And he's married and has 2 sons. And they're all Christians. Praise God. I might not have a remarkable education behind me, but one thing I can say is I told them about the Lord as soon as they could hear my voice, they heard about Jesus. I remember hearing my mama sing her songs, and I said, my kids are never going to go without that. So even though I can't carry a note, I sang all those songs to my babies, and I read the Bible to them and told them stories. And my son in in High Springs, Jimmy. Daniel's in Virginia with Angie and Joshua and Christian. And then in High Springs, I have Jimmy and his wife Dina. And they have 3 children now. One of my grandsons was killed in an automobile accident a few years ago. But they have 3 grandchildren of their own, so I'm a great grandma now. So we're just passing on the generation of loving Jesus.
What better thing to pass on?
Yes.
You said you might not have the education, but you have certainly been successful as a writer. And
I like to think so.
Did you ever have any special training in writing, or?
No, not really. I remember I used to love English class and writing stories. And I've written several articles that got published when I was still a teenager. And one of them, I don't know if I ought to say this or not, but I had a teacher that really liked my work good enough that he submitted it with his name. And my dad was furious because I only got a C on the paper, but he published a work under his name. And he went to the school and he said, "You think that was only worth a C and you got it published under your name?" And my dad said, "Well, it's up to you what we do about it." I said, "My story's in a magazine." It didn't matter whose name was on it. It proved to me that I could do it.
And it was published just as you had written it, you said,
Yes.
right? And what magazine was it in?
I believe it was the New Yorker. It was an elite magazine back then, and it was called "In All God's Children." And it just personified the different countries as children being rebellious and children being bullies and children, just being children. And how God must have so much patience with us. All the world, is so different. And yet he has time for all of us.
Helen, you said you traveled a lot being a missionary.
Oh, I traveled many times. I mean, I've been in South America. I was even with Christopher Columbus, and that was a mission trip nobody ever took but me.
Which of those missionary trips did you enjoy the most?
I liked the one in Africa because I loved listening to the animals. Yeah.
What else do you think is coming up other than the book you're writing? Do you already have other ones in mind?
I do. I'm writing a book now. It's called "We Winnie Wannabe." And it's about a little girl that her mother tells her, Winnie, you can be whatever you want to be in this world. You just make up your mind to do it and you just go for it. You can be anything. So little Winnie looks around and she says, And she looks up to the sky and she sees an airplane. I could be an airplane. I could fly high above the houses and high above the trees, and I could fly above the birds, and I could see the clouds, and I could look up, and I might even see Jesus. Well, that was Winnie's thought. And then she thought, no, I think I'd rather be that tree when that little bird comes up and starts making his little tweeting sounds, and I can be there with him. No, maybe I'll be... And she comes up with all these different ideas of what she wants to be, and her imagination just wore her out. So she crawled up on a sofa next to her mom and dad, and she said, I think I just want to be wee Winnie wannabe.
Oh, how sweet.
And they hugged her and kissed her, and she was happy.
But her parents gave her permission to be whatever she wanted to be.
Yes.
And I think that was something you said probably was not your upbringing.
That was not my upbringing, but I was rebellious enough that I said, well, I'm going to do what I want to do.
And that's taken you down some great paths and the ability to share those stories.
Yeah.
You talked about having a family at Carter House. What else is special to you about the village?
There are so many things special here. I mean, first, it's a beautiful place. But when I hear the bells at the church, that just makes me feel like some little angels in there ringing those bells, reminding me that Jesus is still watching over me. And then too, you know, the people, they have this thing they say, wave to everybody. But now when they wave, they're smiling and they're saying, hi, Helen, how are you? You know, and they're checking on me and they're doing things, you know, to make it special. I hurt my foot back about a month ago and I couldn't wear shoes. Well, if anybody knows me and they'd see me coming to church, I wore my bedroom slippers because I was going to church. But a lady in the church, in the village, in Carter House, brought me a pair of the clog shoes. And I could wear them, and I thanked her for it, but she bought them for me, and she said, I wanted you to be comfortable. And Joe and I, you know, we kind of look after them too. Mm-hmm. You know, we have some people who's has health issues, even worse than ours, you know. As you get older, you have quite a few of those. And we kind of watch over people, and when it comes down to if they need a good meal, we do it. You know, we cook for people, we bake for people, we cook for the church, we bake for the church, and then we'll bring it back to Carter House and divide it up among our friends. So we got family. You know, we have Sunday dinners a lot, not just Sunday dinners, but I'm saying we feed a lot of people.
And feed them and they'll come. Huh?
Feed them and they'll come. And the thing is that they begin to know that they can count on us if they need a prayer, if they need uplifting, if they need to talk, if they need a hug. We're family.
Helen, are you going to be having some more stories submitted to the Friendly Neighbor News?
Yes. In fact, the Lord kept me up so long last night working on my April story.
Well, I think that's a great segue to say thanks for being here and for everybody else to watch for your April story in the Friendly Neighbor News. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.